At 6 in the evening on May 2, 1878, the day shift at the Washburn A Mill in Minneapolis, Minnesota, clocked out. Roughly 200 workers streamed out of the 7-story limestone building and into the streets of what had recently become the leading flour-producing city in the United States. The city had a population of approximately 40,000 people, and one mill alone employed about 200 of them. There were 14 men on the night shift. They took their positions on the production floor at around 6 o'clock and began running the machinery they had run on 100 previous nights, in a building that had been operating without significant incident since it opened in 1874. The mill was a 7-story limestone and iron structure, powered by water drawn from a canal fed by St. Anthony Falls on the Mississippi River. At full production, it could grind approximately 840 barrels of flour per day, roughly 165,000 pounds, making it not just the largest mill in Minneapolis, but the largest flour mill in the world by any measure available in 1878. That scale made the mill one of the largest single employers in the region. At approximately 7:20 in the evening, 3 explosions detonated in rapid succession. The blasts were heard 10 miles away in St. Paul. Residents of St. Paul ran into the streets, convinced an earthquake had struck. Windows shattered for half a mile in every direction from the mill. One iron roof fragment was later found 2 miles from the building. The Minneapolis Tribune described what remained of the Washburn A Mill as a chaotic pile of huge limestone rocks, interwoven with slivered timbers, shafts, and broken machinery from which poured forth steam and water. All 14 workers inside the A Mill were killed. The largest, the highest, and probably the heaviest stone structure in Minneapolis had been reduced to rubble in less time than it takes to read this sentence. Within minutes, the fire spread to the adjacent Diamond and Humboldt mills. 4 more workers died. By the time firefighters arrived, the building was already gone. 18 people were dead, 6 mills were destroyed, and 1/3 of Minneapolis's entire flour production capacity had been erased from the industrial map of the United States. The mill's owner, a former Union Army Major General and former governor of Wisconsin named Cadwallader Washburn, was at home in LaCroix when word reached him. He boarded a train for Minneapolis that night. He arrived at the ruins on May 3rd, stood at the edge of the debris, and without apparent hesitation began pacing off dimensions for a new building. The company he built on that site would eventually become General Mills. The flour his rebuilt mill produced would be called Gold Medal. It is still the best-selling retail flour brand in the United States. To understand how a disaster that killed 18 workers on a Thursday night became the founding story of one of the largest food companies in the world, you have to understand what Minneapolis flour actually was, and why the process that made it exceptional was also the process that made it lethal. Minneapolis had a wheat problem. The farms of Minnesota and the Dakotas grew spring wheat, planted in the spring, harvested in the fall, and abundant in ways that winter wheat from the eastern and southern states could not match. The problem was the flour. When run through traditional millstones, spring wheat produced flour that was darker, coarser, and more prone to spoiling than the white flour consumers preferred. By 1870, Minneapolis was producing 200,000 barrels of flour per year and selling all of it at a commercial disadvantage. Every barrel arrived at market with an implicit apology attached. A French inventor named Edmund LaCroix, hired by Washburn and working alongside Washburn's miller George Christian, built the solution in 1873. The device was called the Middlings Purifier. Its operating principle was simple enough to explain in a single sentence. Partially ground wheat, called middlings, was passed over a fine screen while a pressurized blast of air moved upward through the material from below. The air current lifted bran particles, the dark, bitter byproduct of grinding, away from the valuable flour that remained on the screen. What came out the other end was whiter, finer, and more nutritious than anything the millstone method had ever produced from spring wheat. Think of it as the industrial equivalent of blowing gently across the surface of a bowl of mixed flour and powder sugar, where only the lighter material lifts away, except the ball was the size of a building, and the air blast ran continuously 24 hours a day. The same spring wheat that had been a commercial liability became the most desired grain flour product in the country. Minneapolis surpassed St. Louis as a flour-producing city. Then it surpassed Buffalo. By 1878, the Washburn A Mill was producing approximately 840 barrels of flour daily, roughly 165,000 pounds, and the city had claimed the top position among American flour producers. The Middlings Purifier had not just improved the flour, it had reorganized the economics of American wheat farming across 2 states, made spring wheat into premium wheat, and turned the Red River Valley into some of the most valuable agricultural land on the continent. The Washburn A Mill was 4 years old when it exploded, and everything the explosion destroyed had been built correctly. 20 days after the disaster, a Hennepin County coroner's jury convened at the University of Minnesota to determine the cause. Mill manager John A. Christian testified before the jury that rapidly burning flour dust had been responsible. The jury was skeptical. The initial public reaction to the explosion had ranged from plausible to absurd. The New York Times had already reported that the explosions were caused by gases generated by the milling process. An executive from Indiana proposed that Mississippi River water had decomposed inside the mill and produced inflammable gas. Residents of St. Paul were still saying it was an earthquake. The scale of skepticism made sense given the evidence available at the time. The largest stone structure in Minneapolis had been vaporized by something that looked like ordinary dust in a sack of flour. Chemistry professor Stephen F. Peckham and physics instructor Louis W. Peck appeared before the jury with a demonstration. They held 9 separate flour products over a Bunsen burner, one after another. Every one of them caught fire. Then Peckham made a larger argument. He told the jury that the dust equivalent of a single 98-pound flour sack, the standard commercial unit sold in every general store in the country, combined with 4,000 cubic feet of air, could generate enough explosive force to launch a weight of 2,500 tons 100 feet into the air. That is roughly the mass of 2 fully loaded steam locomotives lifted to the height of a 10-story building by material that a woman in any kitchen in America had sitting on her pantry shelf. Peck delivered the conclusion. Flour dust, in the presence of an open flame, detonates with the force of gunpowder. The mechanism that killed 18 workers was the same mechanism that had been making the mill profitable. The Middlings Purifier suspends fine flour particles in a controlled stream of air to separate them from bran. That suspension is the production process. When the air current distributes flour particles at densities above the minimum explosible concentration, roughly 50 to 150 grams per cubic meter of air, the suspended cloud becomes detonatable by any ignition source strong enough to initiate a chain reaction. 2 millstones had run low on grain late in the Thursday night shift. Running dry, they rubbed against each other and produced a friction spark. The spark entered a flour dust atmosphere that had been deliberately created at explosive concentrations, because that was how you produce the finest white flour in America. The building did not fail. The machinery did not malfunction. The process worked exactly as designed, and the result was 18 names on a stone in Lakewood Cemetery. Approximately 1 month after the explosion, an Austrian engineer named William de la Barre arrived in Minneapolis. He had not come to help rebuild. De la Barre had studied at the Vienna Polytechnic Institute, immigrated to the United States in 1866, worked as a draftsman and engineer in Philadelphia, and managed the gas, water, and sewer piping for the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Exposition. In 1878, he was working as a sales representative for Bremer Brothers, the American licensee of a patented German invention called Bern's exhaust. Bern's exhaust was a pressurized apparatus designed to draw flour dust away from mill machinery before it could accumulate in the air at dangerous concentrations. De la Barre requested a meeting with Washburn and John Crosby, Washburn's business partner since 1877. He hauled the device from Philadelphia to Minneapolis himself, demonstrated it to both men, and made his case. Washburn and Crosby watched and immediately ordered the device installed in their existing sea mill. Then Washburn offered DeLaBar a job. DeLaBar became head engineer and superintendent of all Washburn mills in 1880. He designed the rebuilt A Mill from a sketch of a state-of-the-art facility in Budapest, Hungary, where the Hungarian mills were already using steel rollers and enclosed dust collection systems that American mills had not yet adopted. The new building used exterior limestone walls 4 feet thick at the base, tapering as the structure rose. Each floor was dedicated to a single stage of production, with gravity moving material downward through the sequence rather than requiring mechanical elevation at every step. New automatic steel rollers replaced the traditional millstones throughout the facility. Steel rollers ground at lower temperatures created less friction and generated a fraction of the airborne dust that millstones produced. DeLaBar installed the Burns exhaust system throughout the facility, drawing dust away from the machinery at the point of generation rather than allowing it to accumulate in the air. The dust that had killed 18 people became a managed industrial waste product instead of an atmospheric weapon. Here is the detail that does not appear in the marketing history. Cadwallader Washburn took every safety innovation DeLaBar introduced, the exhaust systems, the roller mill design, the enclosed ventilation protocols, and gave it away to his competitors. Every mill in Minneapolis received the same information. Washburn's stated reasoning was that his mills were only a small part of the country's flour supply, and he could not produce all the flour the country wanted even if he wished to. The less charitable reading is that he understood industrial economics clearly enough to know that an explosion anywhere in the Minneapolis Mill District would damage the reputation of Minneapolis flour as a category, and that category was the foundation of everything he had built. The safest mill in the district was worth less than a safe district. The rebuilt Washburn A Mill opened in 1880, 2 years after the explosion, on the same ground where the original building had stood. It was larger, more productive, and demonstrably safer than what it replaced. In the same year, Washburn Crosby entered the first International Millers Exhibition in Cincinnati, Ohio, the first global competition of its kind. The rebuilt mill's flour won the gold medal. It also won the silver and the bronze. The flour that received the gold award had been called Superlative. Washburn renamed it Gold Medal, and the first bags shipped under that name on August 19, 1880. At peak production, the rebuilt mill could process enough wheat to produce 12 million loaves of bread in a single day. For the next 50 years, Minneapolis produced more flour than any location on Earth, a commercial record built entirely on the machinery that replaced the one that had killed 18 workers, designed by the engineer who had arrived in the city to sell a safety device to a man standing in the ruins of his own building. The Washburn Crosby Company merged with 28 other flour mills on June 20, 1928, to form General Mills Incorporated. The company has paid its shareholders an uninterrupted dividend every year since then, one of the only corporations in American history to hold that record from the year of its founding. William DeLaBar stayed in Minneapolis for the remaining 58 years of his life. He designed the hydroelectric infrastructure at St. Anthony Falls, built the Lower Dam and Lower Dam Hydro Plant, and consulted on river engineering projects along the Mississippi until he was well into his 80s. He died in 1936 at the age of 86. He had arrived in 1878 to sell one device to one man. Cadwallader Washburn died in 1882 at 64 years old, before the full commercial arc of the rebuilt mill had played out. He never saw the gold medal brand become the dominant retail flour in the country. In 1885, 3 years after his death, a monument was erected in Lakewood Cemetery in Minneapolis. It carried the names of all 18 men who had died on May 2, 1878. Below the names, the stonework depicted a sheaf of wheat, a millstone, and a broken gear. On the wall of the rebuilt mill, a stone inscription read, This mill was erected in the year 1879 on the site of Washburn Mill A, which was totally destroyed on the 2nd day of May, 1878, by fire and a terrific explosion occasioned by the rapid combustion of flour dust. Not one stone was left upon another, and every person engaged in the mill instantly lost his life. Gold medal flour is on grocery store shelves in every state in the country. The brand name comes from a competition the rebuilt mill won in Cincinnati in 1880. The rebuilt mill replaced the one that exploded in 1878. The explosion was caused by the Middlings Purifier, the same machine that made the flour white enough to win a gold medal in the first place. The air current that separated bran from grain suspended flour particles above the concentration threshold at which they become explosive. The machine that built the company and the machine that killed the workers were the same machine, operating under identical physics, in the same room, on the same air. It was not a design flaw. The Middlings Purifier had no flaw. It was extraordinary, and the evidence said so then and says so now. 18 names on a stone in Minneapolis say so too.